Beowulf is an Anglo-Saxon epic poem, and it's extremely important in that it's perhaps the longest poem written in Middle English that we have, and it details the adventures of its namesake Beowulf, who's a kind of a Nordic warrior, sort of seeking his fortune away from home, and it's in a way a story that we're familiar with. We're familiar with epic narratives and adventure and battles and so forth, but it's also a story about the importance of culture to Beowulf and to this Nordic tradition and the way in which kind of non-human elements like Grendel and Grendel's mother threaten that. The text is interesting in a number of ways. From a historical perspective, it's interesting because it sort of tells us about who these people were. These people were extremely proud, extremely boastful, and to a certain extent had a warrior culture that viewed death as no bad thing. It was also a culture that viewed the outside nature as not something that is particularly wholesome or particularly friendly in the way that we view it.
Make the earth, but you're wrong. People cannot command. Wolves lone, clouds high, rivers falling into the sea. I alone command myself. People only cling.
You can think about the Romantics and how they viewed nature as this source of God. Well, the Saxons and the Northern Europeans at the time didn't view it in that way at all. They viewed it as this place where people were not. They were not there, and as a result it was a threatening place. It was a place that you could end up dead. It was a place which contained demons and wights and ghouls, and it was a place which was unknown, and it was an extremely threatening place. And I think that's a really interesting idea about nature as being this threatening source which is actually set up against humanity, rather than being a kind of source where we get back to our humanity. So I guess that's one interesting thing about Beowulf. It's a text that's really it establishes the importance of music and poetry and literature and human culture. Again and again in the text it talks about the importance of song, the importance of poetry, and how, for example, Grendel is a creature that doesn't listen to anyone, that hates music most especially. So he's kind of set up to be this anti-art figure, you might say, and so it's actually about what makes us human and what distinguishes us from the outside, from the other. I think it's suitable for puppetry for a number of reasons. I think puppetry always says, I am puppetry. It always foregrounds that kind of suspension of disbelief. You always understand that you're suspending your disbelief. For example, if you were watching, I don't know, Kenneth Branagh play Hamlet, you might forget that, you know, that's Kenneth Branagh or someone else, and you might just believe in the character in a more full way. But with puppetry, you don't do that, and I think that's important because Beowulf is about storytelling. It's about the power of poetry and music to tell us about our humanity, and also to inspire us, and to say, look, art is something that especially humans do. And so I think it's appropriate in that context. But also, in Beowulf, the original text, there's a lot of implicit and explicit action and dialogue, and bringing that out and actually turning it into a dramatic present where, you know, Grendel and Beowulf really do fight, and we see it not just described through gritty and interesting poetry, but we actually see it. I think adds a certain kinetic quality to it, and then that also supports the poetry. Difference between the original Beowulf and my adaptation is, I suppose, an emphasis on certain themes that aren't that are present in the original, but that I brought out. So I think there's the theme about the importance. So, for example, Grendel sees himself as hating art and culture, and sees that as a distinctly human thing to despise, and so that's his kind of justification for attacking Heorot. And Beowulf himself is is inspired, almost like Don Quixote, inspired about literature. So where, for example, Don Quixote sees those medieval romances, and he thinks medieval romances and reality are the same thing, and so he goes off trying to reach this ideal, this real ideal that is attainable. And Beowulf is similar in that he listens to the old heroic stories, he listens to the music of the harp, and he wants to aspire to be this kind of person because he thinks that's exactly what my culture is telling me I should be. And so he unequivocally goes off and tries to search for that. In the adaptation, where I'm playing around with this idea in so much as Beowulf is something of an anti-hero. He's ridiculous and foolhardy in his hope to gain fame and in his love of heroic poetry. He's definitely someone that takes literature too seriously, and I think that's one of the differences. The other difference, I suppose, is also in Beowulf. It's very important, almost like the Old Testament, that you talk about whose son was who and the history of your people. There's a lot of that in Beowulf, and I think modern readers would find that rather boring and wearisome. And so that's been really stripped back, and it's really focusing on Beowulf as a central character and the kind of psychologies of those around him. So it's very much a modern adaptation and a kind of self-aware adaptation. One of the ways in which I adapted the original text was to think about how I might represent a character through vocalization, through the ways in which they speak. So one thing I did was Beowulf is written without rhyme, and rhyme was something that was brought in with French poetry, and so I have in a way Frenchified Beowulf in that I've given every character a voice, and I've also included rhyme in their voice. So the poet, for example, has quite a complex rhyme scheme when he's delivering his poem to the audience, who he sees as a Saxon audience in a mead hall. But he also does the voices of all the dramatic characters, and each of them have a rhyme scheme. So, for example, Hrothgar, he has a classically heroic meter. He starts with a couplet and then goes to have a deadline, a line that doesn't rhyme at all with the couplet. So you start off with a sense of energy, and then this deadline enforces his speech and is often something quite pessimistic.
Once more. If Grendel you slay, my hall will be opened. Beowulf, you shall have more than a token of my gratitude.
This is meant to kind of mark his lack of security in himself, his lack of confidence, and the fact that he's quite ailing. So there's one example. Another example is with Grendel. With Grendel, I thought about Grendel and making him just sound unnatural, and how I might make him sound unnatural in a kind of poetic sense. And so I decided to flip the way that Grendel speaks from the way in which, shall we say, normal English speakers speak. If I take the phrase, I think, therefore I am, you have this dum-dum, dum-dum, dum-dum. You have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. And that's generally how we speak in English. But with Grendel, he has the opposite intonation. So he goes, And so it sounds grating, it sounds hard, it sounds, frankly, you might say, inhuman. And so that was the cue for Grendel there to kind of mark out his character, I think. So yeah, there are some examples. My favourite character on balance is probably Beowulf. He's got the most interesting psychology. He's in many ways, you could almost see him as Bruce Willis crossed with a clown. I think that's a good way of looking at him, and because he's utterly obsessive with a kind of way of acting and way of being which is classically kind of masculine and maybe even chauvinist, but he has good reason to be like that, in a sense, because he doesn't realise that literature and art are a part of life. They don't absolutely reflect life, and so I think he's a really interestingly frail character in a way, even though he's ostensibly tough and strong and active and everything you'd imagine of the male heroic figure in medieval heroic poetry. But I've given him a more of a complex, I think, psychology in kind of trying to pick apart some of the problems with that way of simply being heroic.
Be like stone, he whispers to himself. Be calm. Sleep is sometimes hell. The brain is a fever. We dream of dreaming an endless cycle. We relive the past, like the past was some myth that told only the loss of